Hello everyone, my name is Tom. I'm the Sugma male. You should know that by now. I'm bald again. There's not really anything specific I wanted to talk about this week, so I'm just gonna ramble about some stuff that's been going on in my brain for like the last 3 weeks. And I've just been thinking about the relationship between where storytelling and media and all that stuff has progressed versus the reaction of audiences. And what I mean by that is like I genuinely think that we have like progressed to a point where things are better than they ever have been. I genuinely think that. I do not think that there's been a greater age where just stories across the board, across mediums, have been more well done. And the question I have is essentially like, where does that leave the consumer, kind of? Like, I think that there's a genuine question to be had about whether or not that's actually something that is marketable, you know? Like, there's a difference between being a good story, a good piece of media, a good piece of entertainment, and being universally loved. What kind of triggered me, like, really thinking deeply into this was last week we talked about The Last of Us on HBO Max. For that video, I had to watch what was on the on HBO Max of The Last of Us series so far. I, of course, mentioned that I've played The Last of Us Part 1 many, many times, but despite that, I never played The Last of Us Part 2. And the reason why was because when it came out, things were very divisive. Things were very heated around, like, the discussion around it. People were throwing tomatoes back and forth, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna wait until things cool down before I take a look at this. I don't want my perspective to be skewed in any sort of way. I don't want to have biases going in. Of course, you're going to always have biases going into any story no matter what, because that's just how humans work. We're always going to be biased to some extent. But I want to minimize that as much as possible, so I waited for things to cool down, and then I forgot about it. So this past weekend, I watched a playthrough of it, because I'm a fake gamer, can't be bothered to actually play the game, and I just wanted to like get through the story. I wanted to see the game, see the story, be able to have an opinion, because I was like, well, you know, if we're talking about The Last of Us Part 1 right now, if that's coming back into the mainstream conversation, it's only a matter of time before The Last of Us 2 starts to have that same situation going on. I'm kind of glad that I waited as long as I did, because I didn't want to have, like, that stink, you know? Like, that, like, oh, this game is, like, garbage, like, they screwed everything up, like, because that was kind of the attitude from a lot of people. And I just went in and I was like, you know, okay, this might be bad, might be good, I'm not sure. Like, I've had very little of anything, any knowledge of what actually happens in the story, so I was like, okay, let's just see what goes on. And I really liked it. I thought it was a really interesting way to use the medium of a video game to tell a story and to really evoke empathy from multiple sides. And I went through and I searched out like what some of the criticisms were now that I had context for those criticisms, and a lot of it kind of killed my faith in the audience, because what I saw was a lot of people who just were not willing to take the story for what it was, and felt, and I guess to some degree, it is what it is, you know? I think that the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is a bit of a Rorschach test in the fact that it doesn't give you any conclusions. It poses a lot of questions, it gives you a lot of information, but it doesn't tell you what to do with that. It doesn't give you any answers. It's just like, okay, there's this, there's that, this is who this person is, these are these people who you know, there you go. And that's the story. And I saw a lot of people who were very upset with the fact that they felt as though there was some sort of implication being made there. And I think the only implication there is your real human emotion. Like, Abby, as a character, got a ton of shit. That's one thing I do remember. She got a ton of shit because, spoilers, she killed Joel because of what Joel did at the end of the first game. What Joel did at the end of the first game was not a good thing. Now, I can understand why a lot of people, and here's the thing, is a lot of people genuinely do think that the thing that Joel did at the end of the first game was justified. And the reason why is because, as a video game, you are seeing things through the perspective of the player, the character you are playing, and you are able to empathize with the characters in a completely different way, to a completely different extent, and you understand why Joel did what he did. But for me personally, like I said, I played through the game so many times, every time I got to that part of the game, I sympathized and agreed with Joel less and less each time. I realized this is not actually the good thing. This is not the right decision. You are definitely making a mistake here. And I think that a lot of people, once they went through and saw the consequences of that action in part 2, if they didn't have that same experience of going through and being like, actually no, like, looking at the greater picture, like, yeah, this wasn't the right thing to do, even with the reasons, like, I mean, there are genuine reasons for what he did, but it's like, you can't really be upset at the fact that he's facing consequences for the genuine harm that came about as a result. And then you go through the story of Abby, and you go through her side of things, like her entire camp. You get to know the people close to her. The thing is everyone gets humanized. There's like two sides to this conflict, and everyone gets humanized. And whether you like them or not, that's the situation. You have to view them as human. And I think that the reason why there was such a backlash to the game originally is because people didn't want to see Abby as human for a variety of reasons, but the most legitimate, she killed the character who we had the closest connection to. She killed the character who we care the most about. That's really what it comes down to. But that feels weird. That feels dumb. It's like, oh, like, I just like this character because I played them, and now you're gonna make me play as this character and make me, like, kind of, like, see things from her perspective and start to, like, gain, like, an appreciation for who she is as a person when I'm supposed to hate her. Like, what she did to the person I was before, it's like, I don't know if it's just me. I don't know if this is just, like, a level that I've gotten to through the amount of stories that I've had to really, like, sit down and think about because of my job, because of all this stuff, and just because I really genuinely care about storytelling. But I appreciate The Last of Us Part 2 just for the fact that it didn't pretend like just because this person did something bad, did something that negatively impacted me as the player, that makes them an objectively bad person across the board. I can disagree with the action, I can be upset about the action, but the person is who the person is. And that person isn't necessarily a bad person, and they had their own reasons for what they were doing, and some of those reasons are pretty legitimate. And it genuinely seems like the more I look at criticisms of the story, it's really like a resentment towards the writers for putting you in that position, putting you in a situation where you had to feel empathy. You had to feel that sense of, like, confliction of, like, man, like, I'm really genuinely, like, almost traumatized. Even though it's a video game, I'm, like, traumatized by, like, the things that this person did, and I genuinely have, like, a disdain towards her for that reason. But also, I'm being put in a position where I need to see the world through her eyes and understand where she's coming from. And it was almost like a resentment over, like, how dare you put me in that situation? How dare you put me in that perspective? I saw some people saying that, like, the agency of the players doesn't matter, and I think that's just a trade-off of, like, when you tell a story through a video game. Are you focusing on the story, or are you focusing on, like, the principles of, like, a video game? And in a way, I understand, like, I totally agree with that as, like, genuine criticism of The Last of Us 2 as a video game. But as a story, like, that's not something that's legitimate. Because it's like, you don't have, when you watch Naruto, you don't have agency over his actions, so why would you have agency over Ellie's actions? And ultimately, I think if there is any message to The Last of Us 2, because a lot of people tried to, like, assign a message and then being like, well, actually you're hypocritical for that, because, like, if that's the message, but then, like, you do this, and it's like, I think the message is just kind of, like, almost like a nihilistic message of, like, people are gonna do good things and bad things, and I don't know, it's just, it kind of just is what it is. There was so much being expected from the player, and especially in the context of it being a video game, I think a lot of people were like, bro, I just want to turn my brain off, and I just want to, you know, shoot some zombies and shoot some, you know, raiders or whatever. Like, why are you making me think this hard? Why are you making me put this much emotional energy into just a silly video game where I shoot a shotgun? And I think that's kind of like where it came from. I do think that, like, it is kind of like a conservative ideology of, like, wanting to conserve the status quo, not even necessarily like a political thing, but just like wanting to keep things the same, where it's like, I've liked stories up until this point. I remember stories from my childhood. I like those stories. I like stories where it's just very black and white, good and evil, and that has worked for hundreds of years. Why can't we just do that? Why do you have to try to add, you know, shades of gray and nuance into these stories? And that seems to be, like, a genuine sentiment that a lot of people have. And it kind of makes me realize, like, maybe there is, like, a genuine large part of the population that just doesn't want to be challenged, doesn't want to see storytelling as a tool for like human development and like personal like introspection and even like societal introspection. They don't want to see that genuinely be used as a tool to like challenge people or like try to like make this like greater immersive impactful piece of art, but just want something that already confirms what they think. These people are good, these people are bad, good guys win, that's it. And this is why I say it's like not like a political thing when I say conservative and like conserving the status quo, is because I see people who are like very progressive also fall into this trap of like, you know, Steven Universe, perfect example. Proposing the idea that Steven should forgive the diamonds in any capacity is like a very controversial thing to even say, and it was controversial. Taking a problematic character and giving them a sympathetic backstory is like, how dare you? Like, why would you do that? Like, why are you making me sympathize with this person who's problematic? And I've seen this thing on like social media and just online, because I'm in this space of like seeing people talk about like story-driven, like plot-driven media all the time because of what I do. The concept of sympathetic villains, it's become a thing of like, wow, I'm so tired of like every story making me like basically see the villain as like a person who has been wronged in the past and there's like justification behind their evil. It's almost like people are upset that they've had this perspective and like there's been like this media narrative for so long where it's like, okay, good versus evil, black and white. People who are evil because they're just objectively like bad people or whatever, and there's no reason why bad people end up that way. I just think it's crazy to be like, because I see like this character is human who is also evil, like that's a bad thing. Where I'm at in One Piece, and honestly throughout One Piece entirely, something I've noticed is every villain has like a backstory. Every villain has like a reason why. They have some sort of internal justification and motivation for why they're doing the things they're doing. And in a way it is kind of like, well, I'm looking out for myself ultimately, like that is what is guiding me to do things that are ultimately bad. There are plenty of characters, there are plenty of villains in One Piece who are like abhorrent and like irredeemably bad people, and they have a backstory that tells us how they ended up like that. Part of the problem is some people look at that and they're like, well, now I see this character as human, so I cannot properly feel the vitriolic rage that I want to towards them. Like, I don't want to look at a character who I've seen do awful things and then also feel bad when they get killed, when they get defeated. I don't want to feel like that confliction, you know, because that's kind of what's happening with the place I'm at in One Piece right now. I'm going to be as vague as possible to avoid spoilers, but this bad guy was about to be beaten, and then they went into the bad guy's backstory, and I was like, wow, I genuinely feel like sympathy towards this character now. Like, I see them as much more human and much more like, I genuinely feel bad for them now. And that's like, they cut back to them about to kill that villain, and they're going into like the final battle, and it's like, bro, now I feel like there's layers to my feelings now, because I'm like, well, they're bad, and they're like irredeemably bad, but now I feel like I know where they're coming from. I don't agree with their actions, but it's like, I now see them in a different light, where it's like, this is like a ruthless, evil person to this is a sad person who has had so many negative experiences throughout their life, and now they're in this like, they're just this sensitive, hurt person lashing out at the world around them. I love shit like that. I think that every story should be doing stuff like that. And I think that that makes stories better because it makes the characters real. It makes these characters feel like real people. But there are so many people, and I just see so much pushback against that. Like, people see that as more of a negative because they don't want to feel that. They don't want to be like, oh, that's a human person. That's a real person who has emotions and insecurities, and like, I feel sympathy for them. They just want to be like, no, that's a bad person. Evil person gets beat up by good person. That affirms like my worldview. I don't want to stop and think about like what led this person to being who they are. I don't want to put in that emotional labor. I just want to not think about that and see that person be punished for their actions. That's all I want. Like, I don't want to actually stop and think about this stuff. It makes me wonder, how is this going to impact storytelling and like the future of media if like this is the attitude that a lot of people have? Like, I do describe it as like a conservative point of view because it is like, okay, we've had this status quo of like good versus evil, good guys, bad guys, black and white, right and wrong, and now we're changing that. That's a change to the status quo, and having an issue with that is essentially wanting to preserve the status quo. You know what I mean? Because that is what conservatism ultimately is it's looking at a status quo either of the present or of the past and being like, we need to conserve that, we need to go back to that, like, make America great again. When was America great? Whenever the status quo was whatever the values are of that particular person who is saying that. But like, you know, that doesn't just apply to like political stuff. It doesn't just apply to policy. It also applies to really anything. It's a philosophy more than a political ideology. But it's like, you know, when you have the philosophy of like media should stay the same, media should be what it once was, instead of let's move things forward, which is philosophically more progressive. I kind of just wonder. I'm just like, okay, like where is this gonna go? Like how is this gonna go? Like how are these powers going to, you know, clash together? I don't know if it's gonna make that big of a difference, but it does kind of make me a little bit pessimistic about like, okay, can consumers actually like accept the fact that we are making such huge steps forward in like, okay, we can tell stories about this and that and the other thing and really get people to like feel things. And it's like, I'm not sure how much people actually want to feel. Based on my observations, I think there's like a limit to that. I think that there's a certain point where people are like, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to feel like you're making me feel things that I don't want to. And even though it's coming from in here, even though it's a reflection of just like what they're experiencing, they project that onto the media and be like, okay, like this is bad. Like I don't like this. This week's video was rambly because I didn't really have like a set topic. I just wanted to kind of talk about that concept that's been up in my brain. And if you have an issue with anything I said in this episode, feel free to comment about it, because this is really just like my own internal dialogue. I'm open to other perspectives, like as long as you aren't going to be a dick about it. Just don't be a dick. If you want to share like your point of view on that, go ahead. That's all I gotta say.